Welcome to episode 277 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Michael Byrnes, who served in the FBI for more than 25 years. In this episode, he reviews the 2017 quadruple murder of 4 young men in Solebury, Pennsylvania. Specifically, he reviews the human remains search and recovery operation conducted by the Philadelphia FBI ERT to assist local law enforcement. Mike oversaw team members from the FBI and state, county, and local agencies as they identified and processed 6 separate excavation sites, ultimately recovering all 4 victims 5 days after commencing the operation. The murders were carried out by Cosmo, DiNardo, and Sean Michael Kratz, who were convicted by the state of Pennsylvania and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his career, Mike Byrnes was assigned to the Boston, New York, and Philadelphia field offices. He has worked white-collar economic crime and organized crime. However, he was involved with the FBI's Crime Scene Evidence Response Team, ERT, for his entire FBI career, utilizing his Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from Villanova University and his master's degree in forensic toxicology from the University of Florida. For nearly 9 years, Mike oversaw the FBI's New York City Evidence Response Team as the senior team leader, and he was also the senior team leader in Boston. The quadruple homicide case that we're talking about today took place when he held the position of senior team leader for 6 years in Philadelphia. In addition to his work in the different field offices, Mike's work investigating and processing crime scenes has also taken him to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Since his recent retirement, Mike has continued working for the FBI as a contract employee, doing background checks for the security division. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com. You'll also find links to where you can buy me a coffee, join my reader team, and learn more about me and my books. Since this episode is being posted just a few days before the end of December, I want to be among the first to wish you Happy New Year. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to FBI Retired Case File Review, purchasing my books, and reading my blog post. I love what I do. Sharing FBI stories, whether they be true crime or crime fiction, it makes me happy. That's why I do it, but you have no idea how much it means to me to also know that I have your support. In my January email to Reader Team members, which will be in your inbox on Monday, January 2nd, I share with you the top FBI Retired Case File Review episodes for 2022 and tell you which shows were my favorites. I am wishing you the very best in 2023. Thanks again for the support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent, Michael Byrnes. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Jerry. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. I mean, the case that we're going to talk about was fascinating when I was reading about it every day in the Philadelphia Inquirer and, of course, seeing it on the news. When I learned of your involvement in the case, I had to have you on the show because this is a fascinating case. I don't know if we'd call it a serial killer or spree killing or...
I've actually heard all of those. I've heard spree killing, serial killer. I mostly just go by quadruple homicide, just because it was such a short period of time, fortunately. But any of those are good enough to go by.
All right. I had a chance to read a short version of your bio before we started, and we will talk at the very end of the case review about when and why you joined the FBI and all of that. But I think it is important to stress your position in the FBI as a special agent and your particular skill set and experience before we actually begin the case review.
Sure. I came into the Bureau in 1996. I've been in the Boston, New York, and then finally the Philadelphia offices. Each one of those offices have an evidence response team, which is kind of like the crime scene team. Each of those teams has what they call a senior team leader, which is the person who's in charge of the sub teams and the team leaders that make up that component. We've done it in Boston and had an opportunity to work overseas. In New York, I ran the team for about 8 to 9 years. We had a lot of international deployments while in New York. We did a lot of work in Africa, did some work in the Middle East. It gave us a lot of opportunities to see a lot of different types of operations and work with a lot of different people. And then finally, down here in Philadelphia, when I ran the team in Philadelphia, this particular case was one that if you can say there's something positive about a situation like this, it's just the fact of how many different law enforcement agencies came together and worked so tirelessly and seamlessly to bring this to a conclusion. And it was very satisfying professionally.
One last thing I want to mention before you start is that we really went into the particulars of the evidence response team and what they do and who is on the team and how they get on the team during my interview with Gene O'Connor, who was the senior team leader down in the Washington field office. And that was episode 221. So anyone who, as you're telling the story and has questions, just general questions about an evidence response team, the ERT, I want to refer them back to episode 221 with retired agent Gene O'Connor. Tell me about this case. I don't know where you want to start. If you want to start when you first heard about the case or from the very beginning of what happened.
The way I normally go about this is I kind of tell from my point of view, and I kind of try to give people a peek behind the scenes. You're watching it on TV, and this did get some national attention. So there's people watching this, but you're seeing video from a helicopter, and you don't know what's going on behind the scenes from the time that we get there to the time that it goes to its conclusion. So I try to provide that kind of behind the scenes and start out with basically my personal experience and then kind of take you through that. Back in 2017, Thursday, July 6th, I happened to be home eating dinner, and I get a phone call from a former neighbor. She knows that I'm an agent with the FBI and says, Jimmy Patrick, the kid from the neighborhood, lived actually right down the street. She said he went missing. Is there anything I can do? And I asked her questions and tried to find out what the family was doing, and they reported it to the local authorities. At that point, there's not a whole lot I can do because I know that the local authorities are in the process of kind of working this. But it was kind of on my radar, and I was trying to keep an eye and see if there was any activity with that. I really didn't hear anything for a couple of days until Monday morning on the 10th. I'm on my way, I'm driving into work, and I get a phone call from my supervisor, the assistant special agent in charge, and says, hey, Mike, just so you know, we have some kids that are missing in Bucks County. We reached out and told the Bucks County authorities if they need our help to give us a call. And the office does that a lot with ERT. They'll say, hey, we're here if you need us. And at the time they said, no, they wouldn't need us. So I said, okay, that was when I had first started driving. By the time I got into the office, I got a call back from the ASAC saying, we talked to them again. They definitely want you out there. They could definitely use your help. From that point on, and I'll fill in some of what happened through those last 3 or 4 days. But I basically get the team together and tell them to get all the equipment and supplies and everything's ready on the truck and to get out there. And I headed directly out there with one of my team leaders, Lorelei Schreier. And we got out there and met up with county and some of the local guys who were out there just to kind of give a heads up as to what had happened throughout those days. On the 6th, Jimmy Patrick was reported missing to Newtown Township. He was last seen on July 5th, but he didn't show up for work on the 7th. Unbeknownst to anyone else, since these were different law enforcement agencies, on July 7th, Dean Finicero was reported missing to the Middletown Township Police Department. He was last seen on the 7th and didn't show up for work on the 7th. In addition to that, Thomas Mayo, who was diabetic and insulin dependent, was reported missing to Plumstead Township. He was last seen on the 7th. And Mark Sturgis was also reported missing to the Pennsylvania State Police on July 9th. So all of these young men were reported missing in different townships. And there's actually a show, I think it might have been on Netflix at some point, The Lost Boys of Bucks County does a good job of telling that backstory of how the local law enforcement, in particular one officer in Middletown Township, kind of pieced everything together and figured out that, hey, these guys may be related. These missing men may be related. So over the course of Thursday, when I first heard, through Monday, there was a lot of investigation that was going on. And I don't go into a lot of the investigation because I wasn't personally involved in that. I have enough just to kind of give a background. But there was a lot of really, really good investigation by the state and the local and the county law enforcement in order to make sure that they knew, yes, these 4 cases are linked and how to move forward with that. Part of what is important to know is Thomas and Mark Sturgis, their vehicles were found. Thomas Mayo's was found in a shed on a property near Peddler's Village, which is a shopping, a touristy type place in Bucks County. It was found in a shed. The keys and the ownership papers were outside of the car, and his insulin kit was inside the car. Law enforcement knew right away that he was insulin dependent, needed it, that something wasn't good here. So all of that kind of led to going from finding these cars on the property and also doing some license plate readers. They figured out that there was a car in the area with Thomas Mayo, which came back to Cosmo DiNardo. DiNardo's family owned that property that the car was at. And eventually investigation led them to a neighboring property that was also owned by DiNardo's family. And that was on Lower York Road. When we get there Monday, they had gotten a search warrant. I had gotten there probably mid to late morning, got in touch with the county and Detective Mike Mosniak, Bucks County, Rick Munger, Marty McDonough, all from the county. And we've worked with these guys before. And that's the great thing about getting out there and working with other law enforcement and local and state partners. It's not the first time that we've met. So we were able to go kind of seamlessly and work into it, as well as Detective John Kratz from the Solebury PD, which is the local police municipality where the vehicles and the search were taking place. We get there on Monday. The first thing that we want to do is take a survey, a preliminary survey is what we call, and go out there and kind of see what the scene entails. Basically, what we came up with was it was a 90-acre property. We didn't have any idea where to look at first.
Let me ask you what you're looking for, because so far you only know that 2 vehicles belonging to these missing young men are on this property.
Correct. That's all I knew. As I learned once we got to the property, that the local and the county law enforcement knew that there was a homicide. And that has to do with once we got onto the property, seeing at least one crime scene with blood spatter and blood and flesh and things like that. But at the time, I didn't know until we got there that that was part of what the search was. At that point, they were looking for human remains, not necessarily a live person. Just some of the backstory, some of the things that we worry about when we're working crime scenes is scene security. We want to be able to have total control of that area. Scene security in this instance was pretty difficult. There was one driveway off the main road, and then it's just a 90-acre farm with no fences, no walls, no nothing. Trying to be able to keep people from coming onto the property while we're doing our job was a little more difficult in that respect. And as we saw when we were doing the survey, that was something that we'd have to take into consideration, especially if this was going to be something that was a multi-day operation. So the first day, I go out with Lorelei and Detective Mosniak. He's showing us what they have. The important things he's telling me at this point is, one, he takes me to a barn. Inside the barn, there's blood spatter, there's pooling blood. And if you go below that floor, you see the blood had just poured through the wooden beams and was just making a large puddle at the bottom. There was a backhoe on the property that belonged to the family. On the backhoe, we saw lots of red stain. We can't say for sure that it's blood until it goes to the laboratory, but presumptive tests showed that it was presumptive for blood. And also some, I guess, what could be called possible human flesh on that backhoe. So before we even start getting into things, we know that something grisly had happened there and that the backhoe was involved, which is why trying to excavate or trying to recover any kind of remains is going to be even more difficult when we know that there's some heavy equipment that was used as opposed to some guy that just goes out into the woods with a shovel. He's normally not going to bury a body 6 feet down with a shovel. If you've ever dug a hole, you'll know that it's not an easy thing to do. Already we know it's going to be a little complicated. But at this point, we know that this is a murder investigation, and that's the way they're proceeding. The county had asked the FBI, in particular the ERT, to come out and coordinate the entire human remains recovery operation, partly because they hadn't had a whole lot of experience in something like this, and also because they were getting crushed with other crime scenes, the barn, the cars, they had other locations. There's a whole back investigation that's going on. So this was able to kind of take that off their hands, and we could kind of coordinate that. And we were to coordinate it with all of the help and resources that they had from state and local authorities.
Now, I know this is not your investigation. You are being called in, which happens on a regular basis, to assist investigators who are working on this. But I do think listeners would appreciate just a little bit more about Cosmo DiNardo. Now, you've said that this property is owned by his family.
Correct.
At the time that you are being brought on to the crime scene, is he already in custody? Has he confessed? Where is he?
At this point, when we first get there, he is not in custody. He is someone that the authorities are interested in. He had been interviewed at least once or was in the process of being interviewed. And he was, from what I could tell, and even looking back, was a suspect at the time that we came in.
How did they know that these vehicles were on the property? And at what point did they discover what appears to be blood and human remains? If you could just set that scene just a little bit before you continue.
Yeah. And again, that's a lot of the investigation that went on. I wasn't directly involved with that, but I know that there were license plate readers that picked up the two cars in that area. They had started piecing together that DiNardo had known all four of these boys. I think that was part of what led them to maybe these properties that they had known about. I know by the time we came on, the authorities have already kind of gathered that there was a connection between everyone here involved and that DiNardo and the family had property out there.
You were saying that the reason that your team was brought in is because of your experience in crime scene collection and recovery of human remains. Do you want to talk about that so we can have an understanding of your skill sets and your expertise and where that came from before we get into the case?
Sure. My first office was Boston. There was a notable gangster up there, Whitey Bulger, who was prolific and had murdered a lot of his competition. So when I had gotten to Boston, we had been doing a lot of these types of human remains recoveries through informants. They would get the information, say that so-and-so was buried in this location, and we would go out and try to recover those bodies. And then when I moved to New York, obviously New York has La Cosa Nostra. Bodies are kind of buried wherever there's not concrete. We had a lot of experience doing that as well, to the point where Jean O'Connor, you mentioned earlier, her husband Tom and I were actually asked to go to Libya to go help them after their civil war, to help them set up a program to recover remains of people who were missing as a part of that war. And then down here in Philly also, unfortunately, it's something that we have a lot of experience in. Each one is different. It was something that a lot of the local police departments, if they have one in their career, that might be a lot. They just don't get a lot of those.
All right. Another question. The barn scene where you have the backhoe and you have the obvious appearance of human remains and blood, that is being processed by somebody else, not the FBI. Is that correct?
Correct. That's Bucks County. Their detectives are processing that with, I think maybe with Solebury, the local municipality. But they were handling all of the other crime scenes, the vehicles, which is why they asked us to kind of just do the human remains recovery.
All right. Now, I promise I'm going to let you begin and not interrupt. This is already a fascinating look at what the FBI's evidence response team could be asked to do. You never know.
Yeah, no, and it happens more than you think. And again, just to go back and say, this was a Bucks County and Solebury investigation. It was their case. They asked us to come in and kind of take a portion of it and run with it. And then ultimately, it all goes back to the county. They did the prosecution. All of that went to them. We were just extra hands, a force multiplier, if you will, to allow them to get that evidence. When I get there, Laura and I, one of the first things we do is we get in touch with the detective, Mike Mosniak. After seeing the barn and the backhoe, we start walking the property. And Mike tells me that they really don't know if there's bodies here. They brought dogs out, and dogs hit everywhere on this property. And by everywhere, I mean 6 to 10 or more different locations. Now, that may sound like, oh, there's almost no chance of trying to figure this out. They could be hitting on nothing, until we started to realize that what the dogs were hitting on all kind of had something in common, and that was gravel along the property where there was gravel. So, for example, if you're in a backhoe and you fill up the bucket with gravel and you drive and you hit a bump, some's going to pop out. We saw a lot of these little, almost like speed bumps with gravel. And the dogs hit on all of those. The dogs hit in a couple of other different areas. One in particular, which we'll get to, site 4, which was basically out in the middle of this cornfield. They said the dogs hit there as well. This is what he's telling us as we're walking through. And we notice, and from talking to him and the information that we have, we identify probably 5 locations that we want to start with. To understand it out, I can go into a little bit more later, but to do one recovery operation, to dig one hole and excavate one area, can take anywhere from days to weeks because of how we do it and how we document the scene and how we do it in such a precise fashion. It's not something that happens easily. So having 5 locations, already we're looking at how can we be most efficient by doing this. As we're walking, we see the 5 locations. And just to kind of give you an idea of what you're looking at here, if you can look at like a Google map in your mind and you have a rectangular property and then you kind of lean it left, so it's sitting on that corner down at the bottom, that's kind of like how the property was shaped, about 90 acres of that. Most of that was cornfield. There was some wooded area. If you walk from the driveway, and I'll try to paint a better picture, from the driveway from the main road, it's about a quarter of a mile, about 600 yards to an area where that barn was, the backhoe, there's a house, another small residence kind of right there. And then if you continue past the house, you go under a little bridge of trees, and then you open up to just this massive cornfield. And if you keep walking up that left edge of the rectangle, back towards the edge, the cornfield stops and it just turns into overgrown vegetation and some wooded area. So we walked all the way back there, probably anywhere from 3/4 to a mile from the driveway, from the main road, all the way back and make a right going up the top part of the rectangle to where the property stops. And there's a path that we were taking and that stops. And this is important towards the end. The reason I say this, we got to about as far as we could, but the weeds were about as tall as we were, about shoulder high, piles of rocks, woods, things like that. So just to kind of get an idea of what we were looking at, we didn't think anything of that time. We come back and part of what we need to do is we need to come up with a plan. One of the things I say is that the canines versus the craniums. So the canines come out and they tell us, yes, here's a bunch of spots that we think are interesting, but we need to use our heads and try to figure out kind of how to make sense of this. Another thing we needed to take into consideration was the environment. This is the beginning of July. Granted, it's in the Northeast, but this was probably one of the hottest days that we've had up there. From a strategic or logistics point of view, any of my people that I bring out there, any people that are working for me, we need to make sure that they have medical considerations, water, that we can get them out of the sunshine just so that they can work. It's going to be harsh work, digging and doing what we do. We had to worry about supplies. We have a lot of different law enforcement there. Some are better supplied than others. Fortunately, with the FBI, we have our evidence response team unit, which is based in Virginia, and the THRU, which is the Technical Hazards Response Unit. Those guys are phenomenal. And they were on the phone with me right away saying, what do you need? So I had a pallet of gloves or Tyvek, whatever I needed, ready to come up. But that's all stuff that we needed to worry about. Another thing to worry about, and this is all still in this planning stage, is it's a multi-agency jurisdiction. So we have Solebury, which is local. We have the county. We have the state police out there. So we needed to make sure that everyone was on the same page as far as who was the lead investigator, what was the lead entity, what paperwork we were going to use, and just make sure that we can have something that's logical to follow throughout this process. And the other thing is media. The reality is we don't get a whole lot of cases like this in this particular area. Bucks County is a suburban area. Nothing like this usually happens around there. So the media was out there pretty early. Lastly, we identified those different scenes. So in addition to the other scenes that the county was investigating and processing, we had multiple scenes just for the human remains recovery portion of that. The plan was, looking at everything that we had there, was we started numbering the different sites, say like site 1, site 2, site 3. If you can think of going from the driveway towards the house down that rectangle, you go about 600 yards. At about 400 yards, there was an area that had dirt that was dumped. So some of these sites look better than others, but we had to process all of them and process them all the same way so that we could say for sure, forensically, no, there's nothing here if we don't find anything. Site 1 is prior to the house, and it was dirt that was dumped down a hill, and there were tracks from the backhoe. So that's something that we needed to cover. What I decided was site 4, to me, the one right out there in the middle of the cornfield, in my opinion, was going to be the most important one. I think we had our best shot of finding something out there, but we still needed to process the other scenes. So we split up all of the people that we had and made 2 teams. One started working right away on site 4. And the other one would start at site one and start and process through the other ones so that we could finish those out. Site one turned out to be nothing. It was dried dirt. We knew it probably didn't look good. It had been out in a while, out in the sun, so it had been dried out. So there was nothing there. They move on to site two. Site two looked a lot better. It was up by the house. There was gravel leading to this vegetation area. And then there was a pile of gravel just off the main grass into where all the weeds were. There were also backhoe marks going to this location. There was a shoe that matched one of the shoes of the victims they were reported to wear. That turned out to be, again, no remains there once we processed it. By processing it, what I mean is, and this will make sense more as we go further, when you begin a process, the first thing you're going to do is take about 1,000 pictures. In reality, you're going to take a lot. It could be 30, 40, 50 to show the scene completely as it was when you got there. Then we're going to go in with Tyvek and we're going to start forensically. We're not going in with shovels and a backhoe at first. We're going to go in maybe with paintbrushes and we're going to slowly take off an inch at a time so that we can take anything that we've moved and we sift it through a sifter in order to find any trace evidence that might be there. That's why this takes a long time. So we're slowly by hand filling up a bucket and then we're sifting, looking for evidence, going down an inch or two at a time, which is why, again, I said it can be anywhere from days to weeks for us to process one scene.
And when you're talking about looking for evidence, you're talking about human remains, bones, flesh, etc.
Yeah, we're looking for bones, flesh. We're looking for trace evidence. If whoever buried the body was smoking a cigarette and there's a cigarette butt in the dirt somewhere, if there's a receipt or if there's a bottle cap, anything that we can use to kind of see who was there at that time. So it's not just bones that we're looking for anything else that could be evidence, which is why we go so slow in that tedious fashion. We're processing scene two, and this is all on the first day on the 10th there, and they go on to process. We find nothing there other than the shoe, but we know that that's interesting to us now. As you go past further north on that rectangle and past the house and past site two, we come in towards the opening of the big cornfield. And over on the left, there was a lot of fresh dirt. What I mean by fresh is it was dark in color. It was moist. It's not dried out. So it hasn't been sitting out in the sun a whole lot for it to dry out like that. So that's something that was interesting to us as well. So we had to have the team processing that. And that took pretty much the rest of the day. As it turns out, there was nothing at site three, which brings us to site four. For us to say why this was interesting, there was a couple of things. One, the dog had hit there, so that's something that we were interested in. The other was there was a pile of stones. Now, our understanding was that the family was somehow involved, at least at some point, with a quarry. So it wasn't unusual to find these stones that were somewhere cut, but they were laying out here in the cornfield next to this big gravel patch. The one thing that was hard to tell at the time, you can definitely see it through an overhead photograph, like from a helicopter, which I was told they were doing, and we would be checking those out later. But you could see barely, just by standing there, that there was a slight difference in the color of the gravel from the pathway that we took up there to the big wide open spot in the cornfield. The gravel in that big open spot was lighter, so it hadn't been weathered. You could barely see it. And then when we went over and looked at all of the big stones that were there, the thing that rang out to us was inside these stones, it looks like they were moved recently because there's dirt inside the stones. And when I talk stone, I'm talking about boulders that are hundreds of pounds. They were all pushed up together in a pile. And inside that pile, we could see that there was dirt that was still dark and kind of not wet, but moist, as well as weeds that were torn up, not growing there. They were ripped up, but they were still green. So to us, that means something happened here recently. Was the backhoe used to push that? That's something that we were considering. Taking all of that together is why we decided site four was going to be the most important for us. We started on day one and we started doing exactly that. We started to figure out one of the things we need to do is we need to place this area in space. So when this goes to court or someone needs to find this again in the future, we need to be able to tell them how to get to the exact spot. And GPS helps, but that's not precise enough for us. We need to know within inches of where things are. So one of the things that we're able to do in this particular instance, we were able to drive a piece of metal rebar into the ground and then use GPS to find that. And then we base all of our measurements off of that because there's nothing else there that's going to be more permanent. There are trees that can be ripped up. So we created something that was going to be more permanent. And then we started with the scene. People ask me, how do you know where to start? You start at the very beginning. And the very beginning is, I want a clean slate. I want a canvas that's clean. We start scraping. Now, we don't know where we're going to scrape on this. So we get another backhoe, which is almost exactly the same as the one that was on the property. We ask the backhoe operator to scrape. I'm smart enough to know when I'm not smart enough. What I mean by that is we can go out there and we can get our own friend Joey and go out and run the backhoe. But I want to get a professional, a guy who does this and can work these things that they've been doing their whole career and are like surgeons. All the backhoe operators that I've worked with over the years, these guys are phenomenal. They're not bureau employees. Most of the times, they're not even law enforcement. We bring them in, we'll do like a quick background on them and make them sign like a non-disclosure and make sure it's the right person. But we need someone who's the best at what they do. And this is going to be evident here in a couple of minutes. So we're asking the backhoe operator to start scraping, scrape off the first layer of gravel, and then we'll take a photo. Scrape off another level of gravel, then we take a photo. Well, he's scraping and he gets down to the last layer, right about where the dirt is, and he stops and he calls me over. And I get over there, he's like, Mike, he goes, this feels different. There's something here, like it's scraping and then it's like soft and then it scrapes again. So we go over with hand tools now and we start excavating a little more. And what we find is there's an asphalt patch in the middle of this cornfield. I'm not a farmer. I have no idea what an asphalt patch is doing out in the middle of a cornfield. But as we're scraping, we get from asphalt and then all of a sudden it's dirt and then it's asphalt again. Once we clear all that out, what we see is something that's probably about 3 to 4 feet wide and probably about 8 feet long, a rectangle. And that's what we call in law enforcement a clue. It just so happens that the backhoe, and we had the backhoe operator move his equipment around, the width of that hole in the middle of the asphalt was the exact same width as the backhoe bucket that we were using, which was almost exactly the same as the one that was already on the property. Yeah, at this point, we're thinking, all right, we've kind of hit the target on this one, but we still need to do the hand digging and all of that. So it's still going to take a little while, but we're much, much more positive about this being the place that we're going to start. Day one consisted of us getting set up. We processed site 1, 2, and 3. We started processing scene 4, working by hand. We put a tent up and we're taking measurements, taking photos, and we start going down inches at a time. That becomes the end of the day. At some point, we are doing everything the right way, but we need more time.
Is it because it's the end of the day because it's too dark or you're too tired? Or
because it's getting dark. And could we go 24 hours a day? The problem is no matter how good of a light system you have, there's nothing better than sunlight. So anything that's done in the dark, a lot of times has to be redone during the day because you end up missing things. At this point, I talked to the county guys and the DA, Matt Weintraub, who was out there with us, and got everyone together and told them, here's what I think, here's what I'd like to do, which is we're going to be here for a little while. Let's bring a bunch of people back, start fresh tomorrow. We still have another site, site 5, which looked interesting, and site 4. Everyone agreed. We stay there, gets dark at, 8 o'clock. We were there probably till 11:30, planning for the next day.
What kind of security do you have for chain of custody when you leave that site in the evening? Who's making sure that site isn't tampered with and that it is exactly the way it was when you left it?
Great question. And that's one of the things we plan on. For security, that was left to the county and the local police department. And they were also getting help from other police departments. The 4 young men were reported to 4 different police departments, but there's so many more in the area and everyone was volunteering to help, anything that we needed. So we would have law enforcement stationed at different points around the property with eyes on the locations that we've identified and making sure that no one was coming onto the property. So they had that all night, overnight. So we show up the next day at about 6 o'clock. We try to work sun up to sundown.
How many people did you have that first day at Site 4? And now how many people are you bringing back to do Site 4 and Site 5 on the next day?
From my team, in total, we had 12 to 15 people on the team that was doing Site 1, 2, and 3. And we had about the same on just Site 4. And each day we had about that much. Only once we finished the last site, we brought everyone in, and we'll need them, as you'll see, on Site 4. So at any one time, we could have anywhere from 15 to 25, maybe 30 people working on a scene doing different things. The next day, we come back out and we needed to get done Site 5. Site 5 was interesting because if you're following from the driveway, from the main road, down the long part of that rectangle, and you get down to the very end of the cornfield, there's like an overhang of some trees where it was actually kind of cool. It had some shade. But in there was a big pile of dirt. There was the backhoe tracks, and there were lots of cartridge casings. So we know that there was some shooting going on. We thought that maybe that was the area where the kids were shot. If they were, we don't know at this point, but that was something of interest to us. We had a separate team, just like the day before, go down there with 10 to 15 people processing that scene, and we continue on site 4. If you remember from site 4, we found this thing that kind of looks like a grave. It's wide enough and long enough, and it looks exactly like what you would think it would be. The next day, we had cadets come out from the local law enforcement academy because honestly, this looked good, but there could be evidence anywhere. So we used all the cadets to walk through the cornfield looking for anything that could be considered evidence. Anything that doesn't look like corn, let us know. While we're doing site 4, we also are doing site 5, and then we have the whole rest of the property being looked at by other law enforcement and the cadets. This is a full-blown operation at this point. The next morning, we started early. We get there about 6. We have all the cadets there. And the end of the day, we'll have a briefing. We tell the cadets and everyone who's involved what the plan is for the day, what they're going to be doing, and we go out and we start working. To get back to site 4, one of the things that we wanted to do was we want to dig a test hole. The importance of that is we want to find a place that's near the hole that we're digging, that we're excavating for possible human remains. And we're going to dig the same way, only we're going to go down as far as we can. And in this, we can use heavy machinery or backhoe because we're not looking for something here. What we want to do is we want a clean hole because when you look at it and you look inside that hole, you're going to see on the sides, you're going to see striations. You're going to see different levels, and it's going to be different types of soil. It's going to be different colors of soil. So maybe the first 6 inches is going to be regular dirt. And then you get maybe another foot and a half of deeper, darker dirt. And then maybe another 1.5 feet of clay. All those things are all different colors. And that's going to be important to us. So think about like when you're a kid and you have a jar and you put in different layers of colored sand. So you put in a layer of regular sand, then blue sand, then red sand. And you look at it from the side and you can see all those different layers. Now take that jar, dump it into a bowl, and then put it back in the jar. Are you going to see those layers? No. And that's what we're looking for. That's what happens when someone digs a hole to bury a body. That tells us where we are and if we're digging in the right place. If we're digging and we're seeing those striations, those levels, then we know that we're not in the right spot because it hasn't been dug before. But if we start digging down and we see just a mesh of just one homogeneous color of soil, then we know that this area has been dug before. We can dig out until we see those layers in the surrounding soil, so that, in effect, we can dig the exact same hole that the first person dug. And that's what tells us whether we're done digging or not, if we've gotten to the bottom of a hole. As we're digging and we dig this test hole, and I'm trying to explain this to the district attorney, and it's funny because after about a day or two of doing this and we haven't found anything, Matt, the DA, says, "Mike, are they there?" And I said, "I can't tell you that. I can tell you that this hole has been dug before and it's been dug recently. We're not at the bottom yet." All of that is true because as we're digging, what we're finding are pieces of grass, maybe a little piece of wood or some type of vegetation, and it's green. That's not normal in a place that hasn't been dug and hasn't been dug recently. Kind of like the other soil that we were looking at. By seeing that green grass, we know that this was dug up recently and filled back in again.
And right now, you're doing this by hand now? You're no longer using the heavy machinery?
Yep, we're doing it by hand. We're not using paintbrushes at this point. We are down to shovels. We're shoveling a couple inches at a time, and we're sifting everything that comes out. It's a great question because once we get down to about 4 feet, for safety reasons, we have to do what's called stepping it out. We have to excavate more on the sides so you're not in a hole that's 4 feet with walls next to you. The walls are only going to be maybe 2 feet next to you. And then like a step further out is going to be like another couple of feet. That's for safety reasons. But yeah, we're doing this all by hand now because we are seeing stuff like the grass. So we don't want to go in there with the backhoe and start tearing it up. As we're digging in site 4, we are seeing that. We're seeing that mesh of dirt. So we know we're in the right spot. We're seeing the layers on the side. So we know that we've gone out as far as we want to go. And now we just need to go down. Late in the day on Tuesday, as we're excavating, all of a sudden we smell gasoline. And everyone's kind of looking at each other like, why are we smelling gasoline in a hole in the middle of a cornfield? We see some metal. I don't know, is it a gas can or is it, I'm not a farmer. And the thought that was going through my mind was maybe this is where he fills up his tractor. It's just a buried gas tank for refilling his tractors or something. I don't know. But the important thing for us was safety. Now we have a hazmat issue. We're smelling gasoline. and we have to bring in the experts to make sure that it's safe for us to work there for the air quality. This is all kind of behind the scenes that is not allowing us to do our job because we need to make sure it's safe for us to do it. So we call in our HERT from the FBI, our hazardous evidence response team, and we have local first responders with their hazmat team that come out there with a lot of their air monitors and meters and things like that to make sure that we know, A, what it is, if it's just gas, and B, if it's safe enough for us to continue to do our work, because you're digging a hole and a lot of times these gases are heavier than air. The fumes, the vapors will stay down in the bottom. And if you're down there digging, you don't have the air and you could suffocate. We want to make sure that everyone's safe. At this point, it was a good place for us to stop. It was almost sunset. We called everyone in. We made sure that it was going to be safe today and tomorrow, and we let everyone go for the day. So we've already been out there for 2 days now on the 11th. We come back on day 3, which is Wednesday. Site 5 is done. We didn't find anything there. We're back at Site 4, and we're only working Site 4. It's now safe, but we do have air monitors that are there the entire time. We have the operation. We're monitoring that. We have medical people out there watching them. Now our job is to figure out what this big metal tank is. And the more we excavate, we find out that it looks like an oil tank. Why is there an oil tank out in the middle of a field with the smell of gas? As it turns out, and this all takes time to figure for safety and things like that, we use our backhoe and we rig up a system of chains that we end up pulling this tanker out. And it is indeed a big oil tank, like for your home, but it was kind of cut in half. So we take that out and we take it to another area near where we were excavating and sifting, and that's where we're processing everything underneath another tent. We start out with a couple of 10 by 10 tents. Slowly, the operation grew much larger, and one of the detectives comes up to me and says, "Hey, Mike, is there anything you need?" And I'm like, "No, I think we're good." He goes, "What about tents?" And I was like, "Well, if you can get tents." He goes, "What kind do you want?" I said, "Can you get a 20 by 20, like a party tent?" He goes, "Just one?" And I said, "Can you get me 2?" He goes, "Done." Makes a phone call. This, again, is a testament to not only the local law enforcement and on all of our partners, but the community as well. The community was volunteering anything that we needed. So they volunteered the use of these tents, which are a godsend to us because it keeps the media away and it also keeps us out of the sun and it allows us to compartmentalize the operations. The digging is under one tent, processing is under another, and it just allows us to do that. The entire time we were there, it was just amazing to see everybody working together. And at this point, by about the second day, we also have the family members. Family members are all now holding a vigil out near the main road, just inside the property. They set up an area there. So every time we're going in and out, we're now seeing the family members. As if we needed more motivation, that was certainly motivation for us to do what we could.
Let's talk about that a little bit because you're a forensic scientist out there. All of you are out there looking for trace evidence and little bits of proof. How often do you think about what you're actually doing out there, that this is a person that is a loved one that has friends waiting for you to tell them if their loved one's there? How often do you think about that? And if you don't, let us get an understanding of why or the necessity of you not doing that.
That's a great question. And it's one that's not usually asked. I can't answer for everyone. I can answer for myself. I don't think about that often while I'm doing the job. Usually it's not even a conscious thing. It's because I am in work mode and I need to come up with a logical answer for a question that I have. I need to come up with a plan. I just don't think of the remains that I'm getting in a personal fashion. It doesn't mean I don't know that, but I don't think about it usually when I'm working. There are some times like this when you see the family every morning and every afternoon, and whenever you go by them and they're there, it is a reminder. I don't know anyone that it doesn't affect, but you're right. We're there to do a job. And at that moment, I'm thinking more about what I need to do to get the job done than I am about something personal and the family. The one thing law enforcement in general and the FBI has really gotten better at over the years now is understanding that this takes a toll. You may not think it is, and a lot of us in the Bureau are type A, nothing bothers us and we just move forward. But the reality is, you see enough of that stuff and it comes out. It comes out in different ways. I can tell you at the end how it kind of came out for me with this one. But for that right there, that was more than we usually get as far as having some sort of personal connection.
And also, it was in the media every day. I saw those news reports. I read those articles. Are you ignoring that? Or just as part of your day, are you just watching and reading the news?
Honestly, I don't have time. I don't have time to read the news. I don't have time to listen to the news. My entire day, it could be from 4 or 5 in the morning preparing for that day to actually working, and then late into the night of preparing for the next day, making sure we have what we need, making sure we have people. Sometimes it's just bad enough trying to find time to sleep. So no, I don't know of any time that I've ever been able to follow media as we're doing something. We may find out about it after, or we'll have people tell us about it. Like a boss will come out and say, tell us something that's been on the news. But personally, I and my team, I would imagine, don't really have time for that in the moment.
All right. So let's get back to this half-cut tank that you found.
Yeah, so we end up taking the tank out with this system of chains and everything. And I think the news actually got a picture of us in one of the helicopters as we were pulling it out. And we bring it into another tent to process it. And we look inside and it's filled with dirt. But also in the dirt, we see there's a yellow tube and there's a black piece of plastic and a boot. They look in the boot, and inside the boot, they find a cigarette case, Newport cigarettes, that has blood smears on it, or potential blood smears, presumptive. What we realized was the yellow tube and the black plastic were parts of a gas can. The yellow tube is the thing that you stick inside the can. When you're ready to use it, you take it out, you flip it around, so it's the nozzle. And then the black cap for if you're not using the nozzle, you put the cap on, and that keeps the gas from going out. So once that tank was out, what we saw, the first thing we saw was a bright blue, shiny piece of a tarp. And now we know we're about to get busy now because obviously a tarp is not natural to dirt. But also we know that however fast we were going before, and I know that's a relative term, things are going to slow down now because if we're down reaching around bodies, every single thing can be evidence and every spoonful of dirt that comes up is going to be sifted and looked through. So things are going to slow down now.
So there's no body parts or human remains in this tanker?
Not in the tanker. Nope. It was just the shoe, the plastic. I believe that was it. That was in the tanker.
Did you think there was going to be? Because when you're telling the story, I'm thinking there's going to be. And when there wasn't, was that a disappointment?
No, we knew that there wasn't going to be any. And that was part of it. If there was a body in there, we would have done things differently. But we went down there with a fiber scope before pulling it out to make sure that there wasn't a body. If there's a body, then we need to excavate around it differently. But we were able to just pull it out because we knew there wasn't a body. The thing that got us excited, though, was once that came out and we saw the blue tarp, and then we could smell the decomposition, we knew that we were close. Everything kind of slows down at that point.
Okay. I'm sorry I keep interrupting you, but this is just fascinating to me. And I was wondering if before you got to that point, were you second guessing yourselves? Were you thinking, well, we've been here 2 days digging and we don't have anything yet?
I'll be honest with you, there have been other times where I've second guessed. This time I didn't. Because of what I was telling the DA, I know we're in the right hole and I know we're not at the bottom yet. And the thing that kept reminding me was the backhoe that we were using can extend down to about 14 feet down into the ground. My concern was if we don't find anything by the time we get to 14 feet, then we're going to have to start thinking about something. At this point, when we took the oil tank out and we see the tarp, we're down around 8.5, 9 feet. My thinking was if this backhoe, which is about the same, can go down to about 14 feet, now we have about 4 or 5 feet where we should be finding some remains. And sure enough, we do. Once we take the tarp out, we start finding more remains. We start finding remains. We find shoes, gloves. The thing about this now is now it becomes, we know that the bodies are there. How do we need to respectfully remove the remains from a very complex area, which is about 9, 10, 11 feet in the ground. At this point, it was made more difficult because once we hit about 8 feet, we needed to start shoring up the walls to make sure that they wouldn't cave in on us. We have all these hydraulic pipes and things like that are holding everything out so that we can get down there, but it makes it more difficult to bring something up like a stretcher. It took a long time and a lot of hard work for people to be able to go down there and excavate around the bodies. So much so, in fact, that at one point we were actually excavating beneath us. If you can imagine, you have a hole 4 feet by 8 feet. And even though we were stepping it out, we're still going down. And the bodies are at the bottom of this hole. We can't kneel on the bodies to excavate around them. And we can't just pull a body out because we need to forensically do this for evidence. So what we ended up doing was we actually took pieces of wood and made seats that we would build into the side of the hole that we were doing. And our people would go down and kneel or sit on these pieces of wood and then go below them a foot or two to be able to excavate around the bodies. Very, very difficult work, very time consuming. At this point, we're going to be going 24 hours a day now since we did find remains. it was so taxing on bodies that we had a system where if you were down in the hole, you were wearing Tyvek, it's super hot out, you could only work for about 15 minutes at a time. Once you did your 15 minutes, you come out, you go into a cooling tent, you hydrate with water, and then you come back. The next part of that is then you would start working in the sifting area. And then after the next 15 minutes, you go from the sifting area to the bucket area. So the people with the buckets would stand on the side, lower it down to the people in the hole who would fill it up, bring it back up. You give the bucket to the sifting people. So we had like 3 or 4 stages that people would go through. We did that for all overnight for 24 hours in order to excavate the bodies down there and in order to keep our people safe and hydrated throughout that operation. And just thinking about this, it's just a testament to the quality of the people, everyone who was out there putting forth an effort to bring back those young men to their families.
Unbelievable. Just to have this look behind the scenes to get a full understanding of what it's like.
We're trying to do the best we can. And the one thing we don't want, it's not like we're just anti-media. We don't want something getting out there to the family that could hinder a prosecution or defense. So that's why we need to kind of control the situation. The problem is, I remember the one night, Wednesday night, it was probably midnight. We're going 24 hours. And I left to go get a couple hours sleep. And I get a phone call from another guy on my team that says, "Hey, Mike, I just saw you guys do such and such under the tent." The media had the cameras. They were up in a helicopter so far away, but we didn't put the tent sides up so they could see in the sides, and we had lights in there. So we had to end up putting up the sides of the tent so that the media couldn't get in and see. But what that did was that raised the temperature inside there of the people working and made it more difficult for us to ventilate because we still have gas from the gas can that was down there. We still have those fumes down there, even though we took the gas can out. It's making it more dangerous for us. It just takes more time for us to make it safe for us to do something like that.
I was the media rep, the spokesperson for Philadelphia. I worked on a daily basis with the media. Explain why we don't want them to see us in the middle of this evidence collection. Is it just because we don't like the media?
No, part of it is, especially for something like this, one of the last things we would want is for the media to get a photograph or video of deceased remains. If that should go out or someone were to get access to that and put it out on social media and then the family sees it, there's a certain way that things should be done for the family and for the prosecution. And a lot of that is why we try to control that situation so that other things don't come into play down the road during the investigation or prosecution.
All right, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. Is there a point where the media is brought in to show them what the evidence collection process looked like and what you did?
Well, at least in this case, the DA and the prosecutors would address the media each day. They would have one of those briefings that you would see on TV. As far as bringing them in to show them what we did, no, not while we were there. But our documentation is there to show that. So everything that we're doing, we had over 1,000 or 2,000 photographs of everything that we were doing every step of the way, plus the documentation that we're doing, writing down, making notes. All of that goes to describe what we did and how we did it. But at the time, we won't bring in any media, certainly while we're working, to do any of that.
During the prosecution of this case, were any of those photos made public? Do you have any of them that I might be able to place in the show notes for this episode for people to look at?
I do have a ton of photos. I will double check. It has been adjudicated, so it shouldn't be a problem. And I may be able to get you some appropriate photos.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So we find the first body. As we're excavating around the body, we see that there's a second one. And ultimately, once we've removed the first body, we see that there are 3 bodies. This whole process started overnight of removing the bodies. We bring out the medical examiner. The first body would come out. We take it into a separate tent that no one else could go into except 1 or 2 detectives and the medical examiner. And that's for evidentiary and chain of custody reasons. From that point on, that lasted overnight through the following afternoon. We ended up pulling 3 of the young men from that excavation. A lot of the evidence, shoes, clothing, stuff like that, all came out. And of course, you're asking the same question that we were asking at the time was, we know that there's 4. The young man, Jimmy Patrick, the first one who went missing, is still missing, and he's not in this hole.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
And that's what we're asking him. We're talking to the DA, and he's asking the same question. Are you sure you're at the bottom? I was like, that whole class I gave him earlier, I said, we're at the bottom. I mean, this is all fresh soil that we're digging now. There's nothing else here. We wrap this up just as it starts pouring rain. Around that time, I get phone calls from one of the lead investigators who says that they now have Cosmo DiNardo. They're interviewing him, and he's basically confessing. Once the county said, look, we already found this, this, and this. We found the 3 bodies. And they're asking him, where is the 4th? Where is Jimmy Patrick? And he does tell us where he is. This is where it gets a little interesting is if you remember at the very beginning of this, I said when we did our preliminary survey, we walked all the way to the back of the property until we almost couldn't go any further. And then we turned around and came back. At the time, we couldn't see anything. The importance of different types of photography and other types of evidence, the aerial photography that we didn't get until afterward showed right after probably 10 or 15 feet ahead of where we'd stopped. You could see from the air, but you couldn't see it from the ground because the weeds were so high. But there was an impression of tire marks going off into the woods. That's where DiNardo said Jimmy Patrick was. And he described it, and we had gone back there, and we found, yes, there's a location that looks promising. Matt Weintraub, the DA, and I go back and forth kind of kidding each other because he said if DiNardo didn't give it up, we may not have ever found Jimmy Patrick. And I had to politely disagree because once we saw the aerial photographs, it was like an arrow pointing there. We definitely would have found Jimmy. At this point, we have information where he is. It's pouring rain. It's in the middle of a shift change. I have people that have been working out there all day. They're going home. I got people coming in. We had to go out there. And what we ended up doing was taking all of our photos, our documentation, and then go to the area that we saw that appeared dug up. And what we found was freshly covered dirt. And we also found some branches with some scratch marks on it that looked like from a small bobcat or something like that tried to pull these large, big, heavy tree branches over top of the grave. We cleared that out, took some more pictures, and we started doing what we call probing. What it is you take a metal or a very strong fiberglass rod and stick it into the ground. If something has been dug, it's going to go further and easier into the soil. And if it's fresh soil, it's going to be very difficult to push through. So by doing that, we poke and prod around the area. We identify the area that was dug. Again, throughout the night, this is now going into the night. As we start to excavate, we go down probably no more than 6 inches, and we see remains at this point. And we had found Jimmy was in a shallow grave, and we removed him late Thursday into Friday when we finally pulled Jimmy out.
And I hate to ask this question because it's so delicate. Were the bodies disturbed? Were they burnt? Were they cut up?
What we found out from the confession from DiNardo was he was actually working with his cousin, Sean Kratz. There's some discrepancies as to who says who shot whom, but both of them were involved. What we get from the confession is that on the 5th, Cosmo DiNardo and Jimmy Patrick, they meet up for drugs to do a drug deal. He said he was going to buy however many drugs. He was supposed to pay him $8,000 to DiNardo. He only showed up with $800. So DiNardo says, hey, I'll sell you the shotgun. So they go riding off back in the property. Jimmy gets off the ATV and he's with the shotgun, and DiNardo shoots him and kills him. Goes back and he buries him right there. Like I said, it was in a shallow grave.
The reason he shoots him is because he doesn't have the full payment?
I'll be honest with you. I don't know if there's ever been a reason, whether it was overpayment or whether he just snapped and lost it. To this day, I haven't heard a reason as to why he did any of this.
That's all I can say. It's wow.
Yeah.
All right. And so the next person killed.
The next is Dean Finicero. It's the same thing. He's going to go do a drug deal. Cosmo gets his cousin, Sean Kratz, and they're going to pick up Finicero. They decide on the way that instead of doing the drug deal, they're going to rob him. They bring him out to that property. They go into the barn, and there's a discrepancy as to what Sean says and what Cosmo say. But basically, Dean is shot and killed inside the barn. And that was the crime scene that we saw in there. Further on the 7th, Cosmo says he has a drug deal set up with Thomas Mayo and Mark Sturgis. So he's still with his cousin, Sean. They end up meeting Mayo and Sturgis down around Peddler's Village. People had different cars. Eventually, they take the car to one property where Mayo's car was found. Cosmo drives him to the farm property. They both get out of the car. The information that they have now is that Cosmo shoots them both. Shoots Mayo and Sturgis. And I think it was Sturgis, I believe. One of them goes down and is screaming. He runs out of ammunition, so he can't shoot him anymore. He gets into the backhoe and drives over him to kill him. He takes all of the bodies at different times and puts them in this oil tank, what he calls the pig roaster. I guess it's what they used to do with it. He put them in there on that night and puts gasoline in there and tries to burn the bodies. The 3 of them, anyway. Not Jimmy Patrick, because he's still back in the woods. So Cosmo and Sean try to burn the bodies. They come back the next day. And that's when I guess they saw that burning the bodies wasn't what they thought it would do. That's when they take the backhoe out, they dig the hole, and they just dump the bodies with the oil tank on top of them, which makes sense. If the bodies were in the tank and you flip it over into the hole, that's why the tank was sitting on top.
It just seems like I don't know. I mean, I shouldn't speculate, but I'm going to go ahead anyway, that it just felt good. He got something out of the first one and just kept doing it.
Yeah. And I can't confirm this, but I know there was one point around the time that the trial went on for Sean Kratz. Cosmo took a plea deal for 4 murders, 4 counts of murder. He got 4 life sentences in May of 2018 with no chance of parole. Sean Kratz initially took that same plea, but then backed out of it and ended up going to trial, which I testified at. And in November of 2019, he was convicted of first and second degree murder and voluntary manslaughter. He got life with no parole. There was some stories, unconfirmed, that DiNardo had claimed to have killed 1 or 2 people prior to this, but that story, to my knowledge, has never been confirmed.
And what did he end up with his plea deal?
4 life sentences with no parole.
It sounds like his plea deal took the death penalty off the table or something like that.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. When Kratz went to trial, the DA had actually talked to the family members about doing that because they were going for the death penalty, but they talked about what would be best, et cetera. And in conjunction with dealing with the families, evidently, they decided to go for life with no parole. And that's what they ended up getting.
Just a fascinating case review. We've mentioned the media, and there were lots of news coverage of this. So I'm going to make sure that I have links to news articles in the show notes for this episode. Did you want to give a shout out to any of the local investigators that investigated this case and asked you to come in, or any of the prosecutors?
Yep, 100%. I mentioned from Bucks County, Mike Mosniak, Rick Munger, Marty McDonough, who's now the chief of detectives there, John Koretsky from Solebury, Matt Weintraub and Jen Shorn from the district attorney's office have been great. I've worked with them a number of times. Everyone was just awesome. And if I could take just a minute just to read off some of the other people that were there, because it was truly a community deal with so many different participating agencies. Aside from the Bucks County district attorney, there's the Central Bucks Crime Scene Unit, Pennsylvania State Police, Philadelphia PD K-9 Unit, Solebury, Plumstead, Bensalem, Middletown PD, Langhorne PD, Newtown Township PD, Bucks County Medical Examiner's Office, the Otisville Fire Department, Central Bucks Ambulance, cadets from the Montgomery County Police Academy, and then finally, those of us from the FBI. It was one of those cases where, to this day, anyone I talked to who was there, they were so proud to be a part of something that not only just because it was big for the area, but because it worked so smoothly and we got the results that we wanted.
Excellent. I have these cliches and misconceptions about the FBI. And number 2, cliche, that the FBI doesn't work well with others. And this case is an example of why that is not true and such a cliche.
No, 100%. My father was a DEA agent. DEA and FBI did not always get along back in the old days. When I told him I was becoming an FBI agent, he was very super supportive. But having grown up and having someone talk from the outside about the FBI gave me the perspective of anytime I work with state or local or any other agency other than the FBI, if I'm their first or their last impression, I want to leave a good impression. So that's why I always enjoy working with other law enforcement agencies. And lastly, and one of the things I wanted to mention, while I was testifying in this trial, I didn't realize it until we were actually there, but it was while they were showing the crime scene photos of the remains, it's the first time, my understanding was that the family actually saw those photographs. And it's
right there in open court?
Right there in open court. And
oh my God.
It was very difficult. When you talked before about how do you feel, how do you personalize or not personalize? At that moment, it's hard not to get emotional and not personalize it, especially when you realize that. But afterward, one of the mothers came up. You never know how someone's going to react, but she came up to me crying and said, thank you. Thank you for bringing him home.
Wow. You mentioned this briefly, but one of those boys lived in your neighborhood and went to the same schools that your own kids did. I'm sure that you didn't need any extra motivation, but having that connection had to play a role in what this case meant to you.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the personal connection kind of brings it to another level. But anytime anything like this, It's not difficult to get motivated to do everything you can to bring it to a conclusion. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And I'm sure you know this, and I've said this elsewhere. My biggest problem is getting people to leave, getting people to go have lunch or go drink water, because especially in law enforcement, the people we work with, they're just so focused on getting the job done that I have to think about them for them, their safety and their health, because they won't stop. It's definitely motivating.
Thank you for reviewing this case. I think it's important for us to kind of figure out what your story is, because I can't imagine, or maybe you did. I mean, when you joined the FBI, did you think this was where your career would lead you? Let's go to my standard question. When and why did you join the FBI?
I joined in 1996. That's when I entered the academy. I put in my application probably in 94. It took about 18 months. I actually put in to work in the laboratory. I was a chemist by trade. I applied to the laboratory, and the woman in Philadelphia asked me if I wanted an application to be an agent. And it turned out I ended up going further with that. When I first got to my first office in Boston, they said, "Hey, you're a scientist. Here, come here. Let's go do this." And that's how I got into the ERT portion of it. I had never really thought about it, but I can't see myself having done anything else at this point.
And as a senior team leader in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, you were full-time.
I was full-time in New York and in Philadelphia, but not all senior team leaders are full-time. In fact,
not in Boston?
Nope, they are now. At the early portions, it was just a side job. And in fact, there are some places now that the senior team leaders have other jobs. So they may be working terrorism or white-collar crime as well as doing the ERT job.
That has to be very difficult to be juggling a caseload. We're talking about you being a team leader or a team member even in these different offices, but so much of your job and your assignments for evidence response were also overseas. Let's just talk about what it's like to have to take all of this equipment to a whole different country to do evidence collection. Why don't you give us some quick examples of when you've done that?
Now there are 4 offices that handle all of our extraterritorial or overseas deployments. So it would be New York, Washington, Miami, and Los Angeles. In the early days, it wasn't like that, but now it's more formalized. So those teams get extra budget and supplies. And what we do is we'll pack everything up that we need in these big containers that we can then put on a pallet and put on a military flight or get on a commercial flight to bring over with us so we can be totally self-sufficient. So it's a lot of equipment that just sits around, but we've had instances going back as far as the embassy bombings in 1998 in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, Kenya. Things like that, the Westgate Mall. There was a terrorist bombing in Uganda where we brought our team over, we packed everything out, and we have everything that we need because depending where we're going, we can't rely on being able to get any kind of supplies. So we need to kind of bring that with us. Not only do we have all this stuff sitting there, but we need to get it there. And to do that takes our entire team. When it's a deployment time, the whole team comes in and we take down all these big containers. We load them onto a forklift. We put them onto a truck. And then when we get to the airport, we're the ones breaking it down, putting it onto the plane. Then once we land wherever we are, which in New York, we were going to Africa a lot, we were the ones physically unloading it, taking it, loading up trucks, taking it to wherever we're staging, and then using it there. So it's a lot of logistics. It's a great opportunity to work with our partners internationally. The thing that I've found working in countries all over the world is that people, and cops especially, are the same wherever you go. They talk about the same things. They have the same complaints. They do things roughly the same way, but they're doing it for all the right reasons. And for us to be able to go and help them and bring them supplies that they need and work with them, it's an honor to be able to do that, but it's definitely a lot more difficult than working here in the United States.
One last thing, because for the most part, I interview special agents because I'm looking for a full review of an adjudicated case. But I do want to introduce to everyone the fact that there are non-agents, professional support people. Can we quickly just talk about what role the non-agent FBI personnel plays on your evidence response team? Because I'm sure there are people that may not want to be agents, but may be interested in doing this type of work.
Sure. To put it very simply, they do the same thing as agents. Whether you're an agent or a professional support or professional staff, to me, that doesn't matter for my team. I want someone who's motivated. I want someone who's going to pay attention to detail. I want someone who can work on their own, but also looks for advice and takes criticism. I can teach you all that other stuff, but I can't teach the motivation and I can't teach the work ethic. So ultimately, we take both agent and non-agent. Part of the difficulty is most of the agents will have more experience. So in order to get on the team, they're more attractive sometimes because they have specialized experience that we're looking for. But we also have some great professional support people on our teams, and we've had over the years, who are just phenomenal. They bring more than a lot of agents. One of my favorites was a guy who was one of my team leaders in New York. I called him MacGyver. He could do anything with anything at any time. Yeah, he just made things happen. And again, not an agent. For us, it doesn't matter. It's the kind of person that you are. So if you're looking to come into the Bureau and you come in as a non-agent, you still have that ability to work within the evidence response team, provided you meet whatever requirements they have there in that office.
Excellent. I'm glad that we can share that with people listening, because I do want to talk about more positions and opportunities than just the agent position. All right. So after all of these years of experience that you've had as a member of the evidence response team, you retired in 2021. What are you doing now? We're not letting this experience go to waste, are we?
I have been institutionalized, retired after 26 years in the FBI as an agent, and I came right back. I'm working with the FBI again in their security division. I'm helping doing background checks, actually helping my fiance, who's the ERT coordinator down here in Florida. I'm helping her with trainings and anything I can just to kind of keep my hand in it a little bit, still with the Bureau.
Okay. It sounds like she is collecting lots of great case reviews. Let her know that when she's ready to retire, to contact me. I would love to interview her, as she has the opportunity to share her stories with the audience too.
100%. Thank you very much for the opportunity. This was fantastic.
It's my pleasure. All right. So I always give my guests the last word. What would you like to say?
I want to thank my colleagues that came before me and will come after me, especially the way things have changed in society, doing the job. There's just a ton of tremendous people. And I just want to give a shout out to the men and women of the FBI in all positions for everything that they do and thank them for what they do.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of Mike Byrnes, a photo of the 4 young men who tragically lost their lives in July 2017, as well as crime scene photos and links to news articles about this case. For those interested in learning more about the FBI's Evidence Response Team, ERT, there's also a link to episode 221 with retired agent Gene O'Connor. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.